The second topic that I'd like to speak to you about is unpacking a little bit more about technical and adaptive leadership. I know that Dr. Armstrong spoke to you about this, and probably many of you are very familiar with these terms, but for the sake of our action planning, I'd like to go into a little more detail about it. With regard to adaptive and technical challenges, Ronald Heifetz and Lori have written extensively about the work of leadership. And I think of all of the writings that I have reviewed and read and even written myself, I think theirs are some of the best. There's also a metaphor that a colleague of mine here at Harvard uses about adaptive and technical leadership, which is asking yourself, what gets in the way? What keeps you from making the moves that you know you probably should make, but for some reason you just never can quite cause them to come to fruition? So in Heifetz's language, he talks about technical challenges, which require information. Information comes in. And in a new way, he also talks about that technical challenges involve problems with known solutions. They can be hugely complex and difficult, but we know more or less what to do. They require tools and knowledge and skills that we likely already have. They can be extremely difficult and can require much skill. But in contrast, when Heifetz talks about adaptive challenges, he talks about the need for a transformation, for a mindset shift, that the problems are complex. They're things that we've never seen before. They have solutions that are not clear or easily arrived at, and they require the leaders, you, to engage people in order to solve the problems. You cannot solve an adaptive challenge all by yourself, because the people are part of the problem and therefore also part of the solution. Now, as we have a sense of transformational adaptive leadership, what would it look like in concrete terms? And talk very specifically about what the terms may look like and what the kind of actions are that you can take. First of all, I think you need to focus on the importance of teachers and teaching. We know that the main within-school influence on student achievement is the quality of the teacher. And therefore, the question for you is, how best can you support the teachers? So just as a thought experiment, I'd like you to think about an important teacher in your life. I'd like you to consider, for example, close your eyes and take a deep breath. Think about the context. Think about the surroundings, your age, your awareness. What was it that caused you to pick this teacher out of all of the teachers that you've had that you thought was an important teacher in your life? And I'm going to pause now for a moment while you conjure up that image of the teacher. What is important to remember as we're thinking about an important teacher are the characteristics that caused you to choose that teacher. And one of the things that usually is mentioned is a caring teacher, a teacher who was knowledgeable, who may have been strict, who held standards that you felt you could meet, or at least encourage you to meet. But one thing in terms of concrete actions that you can take now as an adaptive leader is to increase your teacher's professional capacity. The professional capacity encompasses the quality of human resources in the school, the strength of the professional development. You as a leader must provide performance feedback and individual professional development based on this feedback. It's not a one-size-fits-all when we're talking about the teacher's professional capacity. Leaders must develop a culture of shared responsibility and support for the continuous improvement focused on student learning. And one way to do this is to actually sit with your faculty and talk about pictures of effective instruction. We often don't have language developed within our faculty, a common knowledge or a common language that's developed to support good teaching. What does good teaching look like? And these kinds of conversations with your faculty can begin to build a culture as well as a vocabulary to describe the kind of practice that you aspire to. Next, I'd like to show you that I think it is very important to focus on rigorous tasks in the classroom that engage the learner in the real world. So much of what we ask students to do is low level, simple memory, very tasks like in my field of mathematics, knowing the multiplication tables, knowing that 8 times 2 is 16, but not asking questions about how many other ways can you multiply 2 factors together to achieve 16. Stretching the students, pushing the students. A psychologist named James Stiegler talks about productive struggle, which is asking students to reach up to their level of where it's just beyond what they easily know. And they need to struggle some in a positive way in order to achieve a new level of learning. So cognitive demand is another word that's often used. It's the kind and level of thinking required of students. It's also the ways in which students interact with content. And that's one thing that I think will change in the new normal, is that we will have much more personalized learning. We will have much more project-based learning. And in effect, we will be attending more carefully to the whole child. And so another area that I think in terms of increased deeper learning, how you can get students to think about this, is we need to come in what we ask of students. Generally, we do not demand enough from students, but this obviously requires a very delicate support, delicate balance between asking too much and students will give up and push back, and ask too little and students are bored. So in thinking about the tasks that you and your teachers set for students in your school, make sure that they are aspirational, that they are pushing forward with an adequate amount of support, because pushing a student without support is truly a recipe for disaster. Other ways to think about using brain research, including the universal design of learning, we call it UDL, and this stresses multiple approaches to teaching, so that you're not just thinking about one way to solve a problem, one way for students to engage in a particular task, one representation, or one action. This is why it is very powerful to offer opportunities for learning for students that touch on different modalities, on the tactile, on the auditory, on the visual. Allow students to create art projects in ways that can represent their thinking and their feelings. These are concrete actions that you can take as an adaptive leader. Another approach is to focus the attention on the whole child. In these turbulent times, in these challenging times, we need to have an acute awareness of the emotional, social emotional learning for children. What is the most supportive environment that we can provide for children to learn? an awareness of multicultural competencies, something that I've been very impressed with in my visits to Australia. You are very far ahead of us in terms of social, emotional, and multicultural competencies. And then an awareness, as I just said, of student engagement and things that will motivate students. This learner-centered culture, I cannot stress enough. We need to see the whole child. It has a sense of safety and order to it. The relationships of students and teachers are characterized by personal connections. Every person in your purview as a leader or as a teacher is seen and heard and known. I once was told as a young child by my mother that every person has a sticker on their forehead that says, "I'm important, please see me." And I think often we tend to get so caught up in the day-to-day that we don't take time to really see the talents and the skills and the beauty of every child who is in front of us. So you want to have the student be at the center with the teacher, the classroom, and the school in the surround, all supporting the teacher and the student. And as you well know, students don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Finally, a very concrete activity that you can take is to focus on the parent-community school ties and how they affect student engagement. There are ways to bring parents to the school. And for some parents, schooling and attending school was not a positive experience. So having them come to your school to participate, to have their voices once again heard, is very important. Teachers need to make efforts to learn about the students' cultures and the local community. If you can, I highly recommend making home visits with your students so that you can sit down across a dining room table or a small living room and talk about the well-being of the child. The connection between family and community and school is really the fabric that supports the overall learning and well-being of all of our students. Students are about 26% of the world's population, but they are 100% of our future. And therefore, in terms of concrete actions, I want you to always ask yourself before you move, before you put out a plan, before you talk to a teacher, before you engage with a parent, ask yourself, how will this improve the conditions of learning for the children who are under my care? So now, just to finish up on concrete actions that you can take as an adaptive leader. One way I think to envision this is to think about time, place, and manner. Now, as we move toward our last stage, I want to help you think a little more about leadership, and again, adaptive leadership from the point of view of Heifetz. And Heifetz is, he's very careful and in some ways tells a cautionary tale, which says that if as a leader you try to direct all the change by yourself, you will be digging yourself into a very deep hole, because individuals in organizations become accustomed to the ways and means and the normalized activities. And when you change that and you are the sole reason that it is changing, then people have a reason to perhaps resent you. Again, talking about the loss that we talked about before and the grief for the way things are. And so Heifetz, again, and this is his newest book, is Staying Alive Through the Dangers of Change, cautions you to be always in an adaptive mode, engaging others in your plan.